Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Hey, Stella.
How's it going, Sasha? How are you?
I'm doing well. How is life in Stella Land?
It is good. I have the eternally too busy problem, and I'm determined one day I'm going to knock this into touch, and I'm going to learn how to live a more balanced life. But things are going well otherwise, though, even though I am
That's
too
great
busy.
to hear. Well, I can only imagine you have a lot going on. And, talking about balance, talking about life, today's conversation was incredible because, you and I have often said to each other kind of in private, how have we not done an episode all about technology and screens and done a deep dive into that? And without really meaning to, this is exactly what this conversation with Freya India ended up being. We went into such a deep dive about screens and technology in a way that, frankly, I haven't heard many other people talking about.
Yeah. What was lovely about it is it evolved into, we didn't decide we were going to kind of nail screens and the impact of them. It evolved into a very thoughtful, reflective conversation about how living through screens impacts our psyche and our way of being. And like Freya is a voice of her generation. Freya's voice is very important. I really think if you're trying to understand where your kid is coming from, she has a sensitivity and a calmness. The combination is particularly helpful because she's not all uptight about it. She's reflective about the sadness and the loss that can come over young people because they're living a disconnected life. And I think an awful lot of parents will say, I get it. That's my kid.
I know. I think a lot about this because in my generation and older generations, there's a tendency for us, and I've been guilty of it at times too, to look at some of the really wacky stuff going on with Gen Z and kind of gawk at it and be like, oh my God, these kids are so crazy, But Freya brings a very deep sense of compassion and helps us understand what these kids are up against and the kind of loneliness and struggle that they are experiencing to connect and to try to have these lives. And so in today's conversation, we talk about so many interesting topics such as Anemoia, which is the nostalgia for a time and place you've never been. And so she talks about how she kind of has had this her whole life pervasive feeling like I wasn't cut out for these screens. I think there's something more than this, and I don't know how to articulate it. And that's how she began writing and talking about these things. And we get into lots of stuff, including like filters and, self-comparisons and, how social media impacts relationships and dating and parties and all kinds of stuff.
It's funny, of all the how many episodes are we in? We must have 160. We have a lot of episodes in. This is the first episode that I've thought, I want my 16-year-old daughter to listen to that. She hasn't listened to any of it. This is the first time I thought she will really enjoy and be interested in this. So there's something really, really interesting about this conversation.
And parents who listen to this show often will ask us, are there specific episodes that you think I could listen to with my kids? And a lot of times they say, there may be some, but this is really more for parents. But this is an episode I think you should listen to on your own. And then if you feel like it's a good fit, listen with your child. Freya is amazing. So I'll read a little bit about her bio and then we'll jump in.
Yeah.
Okay. Freya India is a freelance writer based in London and a columnist for Quillette. She's written several publications, including for The Spectator, The New Statesman, The Independent, Quillette, and Unheard. Her writing has been acknowledged in The Guardian, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. She's now the author of the Substack Girls, where she writes about the challenges that girls face in the modern world. Girls has evolved into a global and engaged community of concerned parents and young women wanting to change course. She was described by Jonathan Haidt as one of the most sensitive and perceptive Gen Z writers. She went through the social media maelstrom herself and now chronicles its effects on her generation. She recently joined the core team at theanxiousgeneration.com, which is based on Jonathan Haidt's book, in service to motivate and empower teens, parents, educators, policymakers, and the tech industry leaders to act collectively to free kids and adolescents from a childhood spent largely on screens and instead promote independence, free play, responsibility in the real world. So we hope that you enjoy our wonderful conversation with Freya and Dia. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now here's the conversation. Hi, Stella, and welcome to the show, Freya.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. Oldsters like us having a young one like you. We're feeling very hip.
Yes. It's funny that you say that, Stella, because before we started recording, we were joking around that Freya is almost trans age because even though you are a Gen Zer, your writing, your insights, your general kind of critiques of Gen Z trends and culture make you feel like an old soul. So we are so happy to have you on, and we'd love to hear, how did you, as somebody who is a Gen Zer, like you're swimming in this, how did you come to realize that you had critiques or you had, let's say, issues with how things were unfolding, and how'd you come to write about this?
I think it was more of a personal thing. It wasn't like, I've got this real political activism or like I want to talk about culture. It was more as a child and growing up, I just felt like I found the modern world very difficult, and I found like the phone-based world very difficult. And I felt as if I was finding it a lot more difficult than other people. So I was thinking, I find it really hard to connect with people and make friends. I find it really hard to not worry and feel so anxious about how I look and what I'm doing. And this kind of performing online all the time, it was just really getting to me. And I could see it like in some girls my age, people getting really stressed out about, being on Instagram and fights with their friends on social media and stuff like that. But I felt like I was having this real kind of internal thing where I knew that stuff like Facebook was really bad for me. And I knew that like things like, my parents split up, and I found that so unbelievably difficult. And I couldn't understand how other people were kind of sailing through some of this. And then as I got older, I got way more into writing, and I tried writing about different things. And then I thought, okay, I'll actually try and articulate this feeling that I've had for a long time, which is that I don't feel kind of cut out for this. And then the more I spoke about it, the more people seemed to resonate with it. And it turns out there's a whole host of girls and young women who find these things just as stressful as I do. And I think a lot of the people that do get through it are actually, maybe not being honest with themselves of how much it is affecting them and how much pressure is on them. And I found that the more I wrote about it, the more my actual voice came out, because it was actually how I really feel. So yeah, it's just been more of like a dormant feeling throughout my life that now I've got the opportunity to actually articulate.
Wow. We were just talking about kind of new words there, and in a way there should be a word for that, shouldn't there? This kind of our kind of the feeling of disconnect we can have with the modern world that can lead to a sense of alienation that actually it's not a minor thing. It goes very deep. It can feel devastating.
And I think a lot of people feel it, and now they think there's something wrong with them. So they think, I can't concentrate, I must have ADHD, or I must have an anxiety disorder. And so what I try and say in my writing now is that actually maybe you're just having a valid response to how hard this is. And of course it's like, you know, the modern world's very comfortable and it's very convenient and it's not the worst time to be young, but it's a very, very different and unique time to be young, and navigating it is really, really hard. It came from a personal thing, but as I've written, I've discovered there's a lot of people who seem to feel this way.
Can I ask, because you talked about beginning to write about your, let's say, your conflict around this issue. Did you have siblings or anyone in the home that was also young that you could talk to about this? Or like, were there friends that you had in school or in real life that you could discuss this with?
Well, I have a brother who's older. So, I mean, I saw him struggle with some things, so some, you know, social media and things like that. But I think the problem for me is I went to an all-girls school, which I found very difficult in terms of, you know, like bullying and like I feel with all-girls schools, it can really bring out that kind of catty behavior. I think the stereotype is there for a reason. And I think going somewhere like that and sometimes being around people who were very superficial about social media, where social media really determined your popularity, and where girls could be like kind of indirectly aggressive to each other on social media very easily, you know, destroying each other's reputations and things like that. I think it gave me a real kind of cynicism and thinking, you know, I'm the only person struggling and everyone else seems to be able to like play this game, which at the time was difficult, but now I think it's kind of a good experience because it showed me like the real negatives of social media very early, which was that I had a lot of friends, but we weren't deeply connected. We were superficially connected. And I remember going through hard times and realizing, oh, you know, I've got a big group of girlfriends and no one has messaged me to see if I'm okay. And it would be like, you know, but if they want to use me on Instagram to pose with, they will.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like an eye opener.
I kind of noticed this among you know, teens I've worked with. You've really nailed it there. That they feel that they have to be sunny for their friends, and they do a little bit of I'm having a hard time, but they kind of there's a vibe of keep your troubles for your therapist. Maybe you should go to a therapist for that, as opposed to this is where we should bond and become intimate and in friendship. So there are a lot of, I think, young people who are lonely and not quite connecting on a deeper level with their friends. And when they are disclosing really quite dark things, it's often by text, which makes it one step removed from it. And it's funny, you open the conversation with the kind of phone-based point, and John Haidt talks about that in his new book, The Anxious Generation. And he said, we moved from a phone-based childhood from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. Yeah. And that has had a powerful impact on everybody.
Yeah, well, I think about my kind of preteen years. The sense I get from it is I just took my life way too seriously for a preteen. So it would be, again, I'm in this all girls school where, you know, how you look is absolutely paramount and how you're performing on Instagram is absolutely paramount, and, you know, what your Snapchat score is. And
what year were you born, so I can kind of...
So I was born in 99. So Instagram came, basically, Instagram came out when I was 10. And then editing apps when I was 13. So
gosh,
I feel like
up with it.
Yeah, and I feel like it all hit just as I hit puberty, which is like the vulnerable time. And I'm also in an all girls school, so like all of these things seemed insanely toxic to me and difficult to handle. And I definitely noticed that, like you said, like friends not really opening up to each other, and then when they do open up, it's performative. It's like for, you know, they'll be saying I struggle with something, and they'll be posting it on Instagram, but there's not that kind of deep talking about things. And I was kind of like a sensitive child. Like I really wanted friends to deeply connect with, and I think Instagram got in the way of that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
And I mean, for anybody who's listening who doesn't know Freya, I mean, for at the risk of seeming superficial, I want to point something out that I think is actually really important. You happen to be remarkably beautiful. And I think
Thank you.
a lot of people think that the reason that Instagram and social media apps are destructive is because if there's a girl who feels that she, let's say, doesn't live up to some standard of beauty, she will be suffering on these apps. And obviously, all women, regardless of how they look, are vulnerable to that self-comparison and self-judgment. So obviously that's true. But even for somebody who, like you said, people might use you to pose with you, but you also can struggle on these apps because they rob relationships of that richness and that depth. So I just think it's important to point that out because there are a lot of, I think, superficial misconceptions that people have about why is social media destructive for certain girls more than others or whatever. And I think everybody growing up on social media is vulnerable to those unhealthy patterns.
Yeah, I think sometimes people will look at someone who's like feminine or cares about their looks, or I maybe think that like a comment I often get is like, you look like you would love Instagram, or like you look like you would love social media. And I struggle with that because it's not all about superficially how you look or how you like what effort you put into your looks or whatever. It's about temperament and your disposition. And I do not have the psychological kind of tendencies that make me enjoy social media. I have the opposite. I find social media really difficult. And I agree with what you say. I think how people they look at kind of teenagers and preteens and they think, how do they look? Do they look like they're well adjusted? Do they look like they're popular or something? Rather than, personality. And I think there's a lot of young people who might look like they're thriving on Instagram, but, they don't have the psychological kind of defenses to handle it. And I've definitely always been that person.
What is Anemoia? Tell us about this.
So it's a term that describes it. So it essentially describes nostalgia for a time or a place that you didn't know, you never knew. So there's actually like Reddit forums full of people talking about this phenomenon, and they have it for all different things in all different places. It's kind of interesting to read. But I came across it because I literally Googled nostalgia for a time you didn't know, and then found this word. And the reason I was Googling that is essentially, again, this feeling that I had for so long that I don't really feel like I'm cut out for some of this. I was trying to articulate that in a post. So for Jonathan Haidt, I was writing for him. And I think what's very different about young people now is there is this sense of, I hate social media. I don't like having to participate in some of these games. I don't like being on dating apps, but I have to because now it's here and there's no way out.
Yeah.
And I think there's this real grief about that, which is like, I wish I had experienced, like love and romance before it was swiping and like paying premium on Tinder. Or I wish I'd experienced friendship before it was this superficial Instagram, posing with people and not actually connecting with them at all.
Oh God.
Yeah, and it's
I know it's so intense to really think about it. Keep going, keep going.
And I feel basic things that humans need. So love, family, friendship, your sense of self, all of these things in a phone-based world have been corrupted and cheapened past the point of no return. And I think a lot of people feel sorry for Gen Z, but they don't. Sometimes they'll kind of mock them. So they'll like mock young people for sitting around in their rooms, or they'll mock them for saying I have an anxiety disorder or something. Yeah. And in the piece, I kind of wanted to say, imagine never knowing what those aspects of life are like without the phones and without the companies intruding. And I think I think some people in older generations haven't quite considered that they had it better in some ways.
I wonder, yeah, it's very interesting. Everything you're saying there is very interesting. It reminds me of my kids who seem to have, they're 16 and 14, who seem to have that nostalgia. And I think I might have oversold them my life. And like, I didn't have any great time. What the hell was I overselling that for? But they seem to have, but when you described it, honestly, I think there's a huge sadness came over me when I realized a lot of people are now having to date through dating apps. And I think the loss, I'm so glad I did not have to do that transactional point scoring. Awful system.
And the system it's not just the dating apps. It's like the whole conception of romance and flirting and courting someone has changed. All the meaning has been stripped out, and it's like, like flirting now, you send someone like a little flame emoji on their story. And I think, there's children out there that grew up feeling like me, which is desperate for like some deeper connection than that. And when that's all that everyone is kind of doing around you, and that's love and romance now, and if you want anything more than that, you're strange and you're clingy and you're weird. It's really difficult. And I want to kind of, in my writing now, to like speak to some of these more sensitive young women and say, you're not abnormal because you're struggling with dating.
And can I say we were all tested it on a grand scale with COVID, because pre-COVID teenagers would say to me, no, it's the new way. This is the digital way. It's just as good as your old style ways. And, get with it, Stella. And then we all had COVID and we all felt that lack of not meeting your friend for coffee. It didn't matter I was meeting her on Zoom. It didn't matter. It wasn't enough. There was something to do with, it's almost something to the soul, the physicality of being in front of somebody is a much more nurturing experience than meeting them through a screen. And that played out in real life in COVID. We had the test and we all came back, on a mass scale saying, no, it made me feel lonely and lost and disconnected. And there's definitely, the results are in on that. It's not as good. The virtual life isn't as good socially.
Yeah, and you wrote about this in a recent piece about attachment. So like attachment theory at its core has a lot of solid science behind it, but there's kind of this bastardization of attachment theory that really has taken off, especially with the superficial, memeable Instagram things and this kind of culture of, online, particularly therapists and young women calling everything trauma and toxicity and, codependent relationships and my parents are narcissists and like all of these
Diagnoses.
Things. Yeah. And you wrote something, I'm actually looking for it as we talk on Twitter. You said something like, I'm tired of this delusion in modern life that psychologically healthy and adjusted person wouldn't feel any pain or jealousy or the need for anyone. They stay a moderate amount of attached to people just enough that they can detach at any moment. And then you kind of go on to say, like, this isn't love, this isn't healthy, this isn't human. And I think about this a lot because, we're therapists and we work with adolescents. And I notice that whenever a young person has this very intense, strong drive to, let's say, be someone's girlfriend or boyfriend, or let's say they're broken up with and then they're struggling deeply, they tend to pathologize that and think something is wrong with them. And then they go to the internet to search, like, why can't I get over my so-and-so ex? It's like, well, he just dumped you 3 days ago. Like, you should be devastated for a little while. That's normal. That's healthy. So do you think that this is something that a lot of people in your generation realize is off kilter, or is it just considered pathetic and desperate to have those really strong emotions?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of cultural message now, which is that if you're having a negative emotions, it's not because you're human, it's because you're unwell. And it's really damaging for young women because, especially in adolescence, you're going through a time where you are going to be vulnerable to negative emotion, and you are going to feel these things on a heightened level, and it's just called being young, and it's just called girlhood, and it's really difficult. And I think it's sad that we're losing that language of just like human suffering. Now we have to say, oh, I think I had ADHD. Like I was talking about something in that article called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, which is an
I
ADHD.
know about this term.
Yeah, which is ADHD symptom or whatever. And honestly, it's absolutely heartbreaking. There's young women on these forums saying like something horrific that their boyfriend has said to them, or just really like terrible conduct from the person that they're with, and then they're saying, I think I have rejection sensitivity dysphoria, I think I need medication, or I have this trauma and attachment style, which means that I'm so clingy that I want his commitment or whatever. And I find that difficult because, again, when I was growing up, all I wanted was like a deep connection with one person. And I felt like you have to kind of conceal that, and you have to conceal the extent to which you want that. So I wanted commitment, and I expected a level of conduct from someone that I would give them. And you almost have to kind of stuff that down, and you have to be detached, and you have to be chilled at all times. And even if, you get broken up with, or someone is disloyal to you, you can't really show that that's hurt you that much. So I think it's funny because we're this generation that is obsessed with mental health and vulnerability. Yeah, I think at the same time we're actually stuffing down a lot of these feelings. And I just wanted to say in that piece, if you're struggling with like casual dating and dating apps and all of these things, you're probably not sick. You're probably just a normal, sensitive young woman, and that's fine.
It's like, we've pathologized all these kind of very much part of the human condition, which is we go through, lots of us go through a lot of angst during the day, up and down, and worrying about this and worrying about that. And it's all perfectly part of being human. And I think these kids, I often say it, but it's worth saying again, I think that these kids often think that there's these kind of golden lives, and people having these golden lives, and they if only they could have them. If only they didn't have this diagnosis or something, they could be part of the people who are... Nobody's having these golden lives, but they think that there are these easy lives to be had, and there's something wrong with them for being distressed in this way.
Yeah, well, it's funny you say that. I was reading about there's this new trend on TikTok talking about neurotypical privilege. So if you're not neurodivergent, you have privilege, and the way they describe how a neurotypical person thinks is not a real person. So they'll be like, they'll say
a
things
robot or something.
Yeah, they'll say, "Oh, did you know that neurotypical people don't have an inner monologue, and they don't question, they don't like procrastinate or question their sense of identity," and it stretches the term so much that every young woman is going to think they're neurodivergent or unwell. And it's like, it's so tragic. It's just called being human.
It's dangerous.
And this is exactly what's happening too in the gender dialogue, because that's how they talk about cis people. Cis people don't question their gender identity.
That's
cis people don't do this or that thing. So all of these kind of born and bred online, superficial kind of social justice concepts are very vulnerable to this sort of, I don't even know, it's almost like projection, or it's a fantasy, and it probably reflects the difficulties or the insecurities of the people writing this junk. I mean, it's obviously not true. Every single person on the planet may have moments where they procrastinate. That's why we have the word procrastination. Like it's so strange. Oftentimes in therapy, I'll say to kids, the reason we have a word for this is because it's so dang common that it's ended up in a dictionary for like the history of the written language. Yeah. So why would we think that this is something unique or exclusive to a certain type of diagnostic label?
I think that this whole thing of being unable to see that this is just human is actually like a consequence of growing up with too much comfort and convenience and affluence, generally speaking, because you get this idea that you can actually live a life where you don't have to come into contact with suffering and you don't have to come into contact with negative emotions, and you can kind of avoid these things. I don't think Gen Z have really heard the message that this is just baked into life. Like this is part of being not just an adolescence, but human. And I think it's actually tragic that we've not internalized that.
But it's also maybe because the pressures that is on this generation, it's very it's kind of City Hall. It's very hard to kind of articulate that kind of feeling of there's just forces stopping you from doing various things. It feels very alienating culture. So in many ways, they can feel it's very hard to have a villain. Like when I was growing up, let's say, it was quite easy to be Irish and to blame the Catholic Church. That's why we were all miserable. It was easy because there was a satisfaction in having a clear villain. If you follow me. And I don't think it's so easy now. You don't have a clear villain, and that makes it much more complex. And I think people feel guilty for not being happy.
Yes.
And then they think there's something wrong with them for not being happy.
I do think sometimes it's guilt. So, for example, they know that they live sort of a privileged life, a comfortable life, and then they still are struggling to concentrate, and then they say it's an ADHD response. It's not, because I'm procrastinating or lazy. And that's not me kind of making fun of these people, because I actually think I can kind of understand why you would get to that point. But I just think it does yourself a disservice if you go too far down that path.
It very much does. You've written a bit, I think it's very interesting, about the authentic self, and an awful lot of people who are kind of lost in the depths of who they are. They turn to gender identity as a way of kind of understanding, if I can kind of almost resolve my gender identity issue and find my authentic self somewhere within this exploration, then finally I will reach those golden hills that are in the distance. But just to go on to that point, it reminds me of, do you know the Anemoia? I was calling it Anemonia, but Anemoia, which is nostalgic for something you've never had. I think when I was a kid, like, I grew up very much presuming that in America they were living these golden lives, that like on telly, you just watched it, and there's the kids in schools and they looked so cool and everything I thought was so easy. So I wonder, do we always look to, rose-tinted glasses, to somewhere far away has it sussed? If you've always somewhere far away, it's lovely. And is that part of the human condition as well?
Yeah, I do. I definitely think that is part of it. And I think that's part of growing up, is to kind of go through that. I wish I was born then, and I wish I was born. But I do think, like, I have people say to me, I grew up in the 80s and I was, thinking I wish I was born in the 60s. So I know that that's a thing, but I do think there's something about growing up in the 2010s, as opposed to kind of any decade before that, where the rate of change, the pace of change was so, like, psychologically demanding and confusing. And also suddenly the advice from any other generation doesn't work, because now, we're in a completely different landscape. And so I think the nostalgia that Gen Z are feeling for previous eras is different, in the sense that this era is now so unique, and unlike anything we've ever seen before in terms of psychological pressure. So you might be more comfortable and everything, that there's obviously insane benefits to growing up in the modern world, but trying to get your brain to adapt to all of these things that are accelerating so fast. And we are the first generation ever to date in this way, and we're the first generation ever to have our sense of self shaped by these machines. And so I think it's a different type of nostalgia, which is like, I'm not just grieving the record stores and that, it was cool aesthetics in the 90s. It's like, I'm actually grieving this, like, when the conception of love was a completely different thing, or when, so I think there's a slight
Wow.
difference to it.
I want to ask you about something. This is a bit left field, but something that I've noticed, and this probably tells you about how my social media algorithms work, but there are certain types of videos and certain types of media that are actually antithetical to all of these high-tech, fast-paced things we're talking about that I think have gotten really popular. So, for example, I watch these videos. They're usually like 2 hours long, and they're filming in somewhat of a very remote location in like Kazakhstan, where it's like this older woman cooking a meal from scratch. And it's a beautiful scenery, and it takes forever. She's pumping water out of a well. She's grinding the wheat to make the flour. And it's this incredibly elaborate and long time process. And in those videos, what I notice is that there's a lack of voiceover, sound effects. There's no like fast pace, like, oh my God, if you want the 10 tips for eating healthy, like it's not that at all. It's this very slow. And I wonder, like, is that kind of speaking to this craving that people have? And I guess on top of that, these are all what I'm thinking about is like, you know, the farm with the ducks, and a lot of young people watch like animal videos and nature videos and things like that. But what you're talking about is missing a time or wanting a time where you could be in a busy city. You could be in a social setting without the technology involved. So I know those are kind of two different things, but I'm really curious about like the way new popular media indicates something that we're craving. And like, how could you ever even get to watching a video of like an old school time where it's just a bunch of people at a party and no cell phones, and you like see someone over there and you're like, oh my God, did you go to that concert? I see your shirt. Or that is kind of gone. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's just random thoughts.
I think that's definitely, there's a fatigue. There's like a fatigue with the relentless bombarding of like the short form content and TikToks and
Gotcha.
stimulation. Like there's just a fatigue with it. And I do notice like in myself and other women my age and my friends, like it's everyone seems to be making small adjustments, which is like, okay, I'm actually going to start like this miraculous thing where I'm going to walk without listening to music. And people are like so amazed that it gives you good health benefits. Or they'll be like, oh, I'm going to, you know, not look at my phone for the first hour of the day. And it's crazy how the benefit.
Yeah.
So it's just like, it seems like common sense, but we're like rediscovering peace and like having a moment of disconnection. But I think that the tragic thing about what you said about, you know, whether we can have like parties where people aren't on their phones is like, the thing I find really sad is as an individual, you can do all you can to detach yourself, but you can't detach other people. So you can, you know, I can detach myself from social media. I can not go on dating apps. I can have rules for myself. But if I want to find love or if I want good friendship, I can't control that they're in this culture and it's affecting how they communicate with me or how they are. And so it's kind of difficult. You can do all you can individually, but then everyone else is so caught up in this. It's really hard to find people who are also on that path.
Wow. You know the way they say every time you put down your phone, there's a multi-billion industry getting you to pick it back up. There really is.
Yeah, no, it's no, like young girls have absolutely no chance against it because it's, I also find that I get that argument a lot where I'll kind of talk about something that's happening to like 12-year-olds on their phone, and I'll get people saying, you know, well, they can just decide to not use it. And it's like, well, a 12-year-old girl's brain versus the most advanced AI.
Yeah.
It's no match at all.
I mean, even for the adults, like you said, to not have your phone on for the first hour of your day, it is almost a monumental commitment that you have to make. And I'm a fully formed adult who didn't grow up with these screens. And I know, I mean, I was telling our producer before we started, I accidentally put my phone in the washer last week, in our clothing washer. So I was without a phone for a day, and I was anxious, and I had my computer, like I had other technology. So yeah, a 12-year-old girl up against that seems impossible. And I wonder if the resistance, because you said there's a fatigue, and I wonder if the next stage of this is a sort of resistance where I don't know if this exists, but maybe there's like some sort of online group where it's a local based group and everyone commits to going to an outing together and nobody brings their phone. So you only use the technology to establish like the location and the time. But then once you are there, like nobody uses their phone and people are really deliberate. Kind of like, Lenore Skenazy, how she did the free range childhood or whatever. I wonder if there's room for something like that. If there was, I would be so interested in it. Like maybe you start it, Freya. I mean, you'd be the best person primed for this.
Yeah, well, I do think like things like even like I see all these like dating events and they're like, oh, we're going to get you off the dating apps, which I think is good, go meet in real life. But I think it needs to be like, and no one can bring their phone into the venue. Like, because I just think it's really hard to articulate, but it's almost like a spiritual thing where I just feel when the phones are there, when you can even just see a phone, it cheapens it. Like there's something about it. And I think especially for young people, like as you just said, there's an anxiety when you're not with your phone. So you can't actually like, there's an anxiety when you're not with your phone and there's an anxiety that you need to be checking it all the time. And I think that only breaks when you're away from it long enough to kind of get out of the addiction. So if, for example, if you don't go on your phone for like 20 minutes, you'll be really anxious because you'll be like, I'm missing something. And then like an hour, if you go an hour, you'll start to get less anxious. And then if you go actually like beyond that, if you go to like 5 hours, then you start to not feel the need to check. Like I've tried it with myself and it's literally just an addiction. It's a habit. So I think we need events where it's like, okay, for hours, you can't be on your phone. But I think people think an emergency is going to happen or something. They're like, I can't be without it. It's scary.
Yeah. And I wonder, Stella, if you see this too, but when I talk to clients, I know for sure they use their phone as this kind of interim appeaser of their anxiety. So like you're talking, Freya, about the FOMO, but the other side of that is if you're an anxious person who struggles socially, every time you feel weird or awkward or nobody's talking to you, you just literally open your phone. You do anything on it. Like you could literally just be swiping through your apps. You're not actually looking for something that you might have missed. So it's really exacerbating the social difficulties that a lot of young people have by kind of comforting them. And like if you're at a party and there's an awkward moment where nobody's talking to you and you're not talking to anybody, that's the learning opportunity. That's when you put your eyes up into the room and you look around and you look for someone else who's not talking to anyone and you go say hello or you go grab a drink and see who's by the bar or whatever. I mean, not for 15-year-olds, no bars, no alcohol, right? But those are the moments.
Yeah.
But actually, if you have your phone, you can stay in your own little tunnel of screen time and you're not actually using, I mean, those are the moments when connections are made. So it's really ironic. It's robbing people of that too.
I've noticed as well, like with my kids being teenagers, that there's a staying in their own bubble, if you follow me, socially. And I've thought it was very much because of what you've said, Sasha, that there isn't a feeling of being at a party or something and meeting new people. Because when you're in that funny space, you're on your phone. You're not looking around. So you don't make random friendships as you're going along. But something you lifted, Freya, is actually been studied, which was they did a study of people's cognitive concentration. First of all, when the phone was on the table.
Oh, yeah.
Then when the phone was, and then out of the room. And it improved each time. You are most jittery if the phone is on the table, then a little bit less if the phone is in the bag. And then you're at your best when the phone is out of the room, out of sight, forget about it. You are actually cognitively, you're more able to concentrate. That is seismic. With all these kids in their classes with the phone, they grab the phone like a blankie. It's like their drug. It's like a cigarette, if you follow me, the way they clutch it. But I do want to move it on because it's very interesting. But I am madly keen to hear about what you've said about the authentic self and how you can't buy an authentic self. Could we get a bit of space to this? Because you and I, Sasha, we hear so much about the authentic self. It has become a consumer product, the authentic self. And it's such an alluring concept that there's an authentic self somewhere within me. And when I find that authentic self, everything will be at one. You know what I mean? Everything will be right because myself will be found. It's so alluring, but it's frightening because it's wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I see it. So the first place I saw it was a lot of beauty marketing. So it would be like, like get Botox to feel like your real self or something, or realign with yourself, or if you get this hair thing or this makeup product, it's like it's going to unleash your real self. So I'd seen that kind of here and there, and then I'd also seen it with like the wellness industry and the pharmaceutical industry. So they would start saying things like, oh, taking this medication can make you feel more like yourself, or find yourself through this kind of inner healing work that's kind of vague and very expensive. And like, it's just a phrase that I was seeing over and over. But the place I was seeing it the most is obviously toward trans people. It was saying, you buy, like literally like plastic surgeons saying, if you get this boob job, essentially, you will feel like your authentic self. And if you get, so I'd seen, it was like, I think it was Maybelline or some makeup brand. They did a video with a transgender person saying, the title was like, I got 10 hours of facial surgery to be my authentic self. And I'm thinking, I find it so difficult to believe that your sense of inner harmony comes from 10 hours of someone just mutilating your face to fit a beauty standard, which is essentially created by companies anyway. It just all seems, there's so many layers to it that are so superficial. I just think that cannot be where you're finding your inner peace or your real self. And I noticed that there's just no talk of like, so in my mind, when previous generations would talk about, being true to yourself and finding yourself, it would be about your actions and your character, like your
It was
decency.
not about your looks.
No, it was about your character, and are you acting authentically, and are you like aligned, and if you'd been on like this moral kind of journey, then you'd find your real self. And instead, now we're teaching a generation that that's something that you buy. And so if you're not buying it, or if you can't afford to buy it, you feel in this constant state of mismatch and misalignment that you're not your real self. And I think it's actually incredibly cruel. And I think it's cruel even to tell people who have gender dysphoria that the path to their authentic self costs this much, emotionally and financially. It costs that much. And you're going to need to save for it. And there's people on forums saying, I've spent £10,000 and I still don't feel aligned. And it's because the alignment is an internal thing. You'll never feel that way from a purchase.
I remember hearing a scene, Jazz Jennings, I Am Jazz, and there was a forlorn moment. She's on the bed, she's had loads of surgeries, and she just said, I still don't feel like my true self. And it's just really sad, because she's just thinking, and I'm there thinking, well, this idea of the true self is very similar to this idea that there's all this happiness out there. You know what I mean? It's very similar. It's very adjacent to it. This idea that there's this self that will just kind of be at ease once we find this self within. That it feels very similar. Yeah.
Again, you're being sold as a solution to a negative emotion. With the beauty stuff, you see the same thing. You see these, like, for example, these influencers who've had a lot of cosmetic surgeries, or they've enhanced every single feature they could possibly enhance. And they get to the end of that and they say, I still think I'm ugly, or there's still something in me that thinks, I'm going to get abandoned, or someone doesn't love me. So it's a deeper thing. But I think it's really troubling with companies targeting trans people, because it's kind of their only messaging can be this: be your authentic self, be your authentic self. And I think people get blind to it, because I was trying to say in that piece, we find the marketing of the beauty industry really objectionable when they do this. Mm-hmm. Like when they say like some boob job is finding yourself, we kind of cringe, because it's just so not true. And then the pharmaceutical industry do it and we cringe. And then you combine the two, and then that's who's targeting transgender people. It's the same. It's the same tactics. So, it's still just as exploitative, even if you have real emotional pain and misalignment and you don't feel right. That cannot be the answer.
As well as that, when I look in the mirror, I suppose less so now. I was just saying, I think today, that I've never looked at myself so much since basically Zoom and COVID and my Zoom-based lifestyle that suddenly arose since COVID. I actually didn't know my face very well until COVID came. I literally didn't know it, as I know it so much more now. If you follow me, the symmetry of my face and stuff, I've noticed all sorts of flaws that I didn't know before, wasn't even aware of. But I think many of us can feel a slight sense of disconnect that person in the mirror is me, if you follow me, that it's like, oh, that's my visual representation. Isn't it kind of funny? I'm in here and that's how I look. I often feel I look a little bit different than who I am inside. I don't really know what I'm thinking, but I've often felt it. And I think a lot of people would feel it. And I think that's kind of what they're talking about when they're talking about this true self. And I think it's actually just a very common... I'm much more at ease at Sasha's face than I am with mine, because I look at Sasha, if you follow me, or something like that.
Yeah, I think in the piece I kind of said, I think the reason this marketing works for young people is because of social media. So in my mind, everyone has this kind of ambient dysphoria now with themselves, because you're just looking at your face so much all the time. And girls especially, you look at some of the statistics, it's I think it's 80% of girls in the UK have edited their face or used a filter before age 13. And that plays it down. The amount they're using these filters is insane.
Oh my God.
Throughout puberty. So their entire view of their face is shaped by them turning themselves into an avatar all the time, and looking at that version, then looking in the mirror, then kind of, everyone talks about seeing other people who've edited themselves and that makes you feel bad. But editing yourself and seeing yourself through a filter, I'm not surprised people have dysmorphia and dysphoria, this mismatch, because even I have a mismatch in the mirror, because I'm that doesn't look like me on Zoom, and that doesn't look like me.
Yeah.
My front camera is different to to a picture. And it's obviously we have dysphoria because we have us and then a virtual avatar, and they're different.
I've thought a lot about the way social media, and particularly the visually based platforms like Instagram specifically, how that has altered so many things, not just how we see ourselves, but, for example, I've always really been into cooking. So I've been watching cooking shows and cooking related media for a long, long time. And I've noticed now that there are so many food trends that are really, you can tell they were created because it will make an amazing Instagram shot. So foods with insane colors or very bizarre, theatrical, you pour the thing over the thing and it makes a bubble of the thing or whatever. So there's also a version of this that is, everything is staged, right? So we could argue that people have been concerned about their appearance for a long time, and maybe an amazing photographer would catch somebody with the studio lighting just right and make these beautiful portraits or whatever. But everybody is staging these things, and the fillers and the plastic surgery and all of that is so artificial, rather than capturing something that happens to be delicious or happens to be beautiful or happens to be whatever. It's so deliberate and it's so put on. And you talked a little bit about this in a piece about you don't have to share everything on social media or something along those lines. So can you talk to us a bit about that? Because I'm very interested in how the staging of everything is impacting us.
Well, so that one was, I did one about not documenting everything online, which a big part of that, and I think it plays into other things like mental health trends and gender dysphoria and all these things. A big worry of mine with that is when you share these things online, you have to categorize yourself on social media. Inevitably you categorize yourself because you have to kind of make your life or what you're sharing digestible to other people and marketable. So for example, if you have anxiety and you're talking about it online, you're going to have to frame it in a way that's that's marketing it to people and making it
Wow.
interesting and engaging. And if you have gender dysphoria and you're talking about that, there's a certain way you're going to present that. And the problem is you're then categorized. So if you grow out of that or you change who you are, you suddenly look very inauthentic, or you have to kind of explain why your personal brand isn't quite like aligning anymore. And so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then the other side, the danger of that again is the more you share online about it and the more you research it, the algorithm learns it about you and then feeds you more of it. So not only is it a self-fulfilling prophecy, but you have all this software engineering ensuring that you don't forget and ensuring that you're kept in your category. And so I think, there's probably young people with real emotional pain, really feeling mismatched from their gender or anxiety or whatever it is. But the second you kind of tell the internet and social media that, you're pretty much guaranteeing that you have to stick with it in some way. And I think we're like robbing ourselves of the ability to just move on and recover from a lot of stuff.
And we're simplifying as well. I do it myself now. I've recognized myself in it when you were saying it. You write a post and then suddenly you realize, hang on, I have to convey thumbs up or thumbs down. I kind of have to say, this is good, this is bad. So I kind of sometimes have to kind of flag that in the post. So it's a kind of a form of branding. And I don't even know why I have to do it, but you know that people are going to misinterpret it unless I make it clear, this is a happy story, this is a sad story. Yeah. But that's completely simplifying the complexity of any given situation. And so it's continuously making ourselves more superficial and more simple rather than we contain multitudes. There's all sorts of ups and downs in this story.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
We have to kind of package it.
Yes, yeah. So it's young people trying to package their personality into something that is kind of coherent to other people, which is, you can't really do at any age, but let alone at adolescence, because you're just going to change rapidly from that point. But now it's like, if you imagine your entire preteens is documented online, and then as a teen, it's kind of like if you grow up with a group of friends and then if you move away, you can kind of start again and be someone else.
Yeah.
But there's no like moving away anymore because it's all online, it's all documented. And you're also friends on Facebook and following all of these people that have known you through those years, and they're not going anywhere. You can't block or unfriend them because it's rude and weird. So whatever you are at like 13 or whatever you think you are, you are kind of compelled to stick with it. And especially if you develop an audience around that. So if you get a few thousand followers on TikTok because you're sharing your gender identity journey, if you suddenly say, I don't feel like this anymore, your personal brand has been destroyed, and people will accuse you of being inauthentic and bring up old videos and be like, well, you said this when you were 12. How come you're saying, so it's just like, I just try to tell young people, like, don't document just for the sake of who you might be in 5 years could be completely different. And I see like young people documenting some seriously vulnerable stuff, like telling the world their really like brutal breakup stories, or showing like their depression room that's like they can't clean up because they're so, and these are painful things, but it's like, do you personally want them out there when you're trying to look for a career, or when you want to just be a different person? Maybe like you had social anxiety when you were 14, but do you want to be reminded of that when you're 25 and you're over it? It's just, yeah.
When I hear you say that, it kind of makes me think about the desperation and the desire for feeling seen and heard and connected. And it's like the example of the depression room is really interesting, because I can only imagine, like, if somebody really is in the throes of depression and they haven't been able to clean up their room for a long time, if they were living solely in the 3D world, kind of like that nostalgia, let's say they were in the 80s, it would probably take them a long time to be brave enough to invite their friend over to their house to see that room. And then when the friend saw the room, they might be like, holy crap, man, like, what's happening here with you? And then it like maybe leads into this deeper conversation. But you have this account.
I think a lot of this is loneliness. Like, you look at like hashtag mental health on TikTok. It's got like 130 billion views, and you're just like, why do these people, like, there's people trying to share information and, you know, mental health awareness, like there's some good stuff on there, but most of it is just like confessional stuff. And it's like, why do these young people not have an outlet, a real deep connection to tell these things to? And, you know, if you look at some of the statistics, like, it gets really depressing, but if you look at the statistics on friendship or family breakdown and the amount of people, young people have in their lives that they're deeply connected to, is plummeting. And then as that plummets, all of this opening up about mental health is going up, and people are saying, oh, you know, this is great. This is like, you know, we're fighting the stigma, we're becoming more aware. But it's like, or is it also a sign that we're just lonely and the only people we feel we can tell are like strangers on the internet?
Oh, wow.
So I feel like I'm being so depressing.
No, that's, you know, I was just going to ask if somebody is around your age or a bit younger, or like parents are listening to this, what's the antidote to this? I mean, how do you, like, for example, when we get off this podcast, are you going to leave your home and then go have lunch with a friend in person? Like, how can we encourage people to build habits and behaviors and aspects of their life to combat some of this? Because it can feel very dismal when we're all locked into these screens.
I think it's about really finding people in your life that you deeply connect to. Because I hear a lot of people say to me, they're like, oh, you know, I couldn't leave Instagram because all my friends won't be able to contact me. And it's like, I don't have Instagram. And when people from school contact me, it's not because they've seen my Instagram story or I've reminded them that I exist. They've just remembered that I exist. Something in life has reminded them. And them reaching out to me is so deep and meaningful, because it's like, you're not just reacting to my story. You're thinking of me as a person. And they usually come to me with something which is like, oh, do you remember this thing that happened? And then we go and meet up. So I have few friends, but the friends I have, the connection is so fulfilling that I have no need to be on Instagram, because I'm like, okay, well, the people I love and who love me don't care what I post on Instagram, because it's not me. They care about actually me. So I think for young people, it's like, if you meet someone that you do have that deep connection with, you know, keep them around, and kind of cherish it. And people who, you know, if you aren't on Instagram, wouldn't stay in touch with you, then just leave it. I just don't think it's worth it. So I would say, you know, as many real life events as you can possibly do with real people who care about you, not who you're performing online. And I think as well, like, being able to open up about some of this stuff, but not on TikTok, to each other, which is like, okay, I'm going to be really vulnerable and be the first to admit that I want a committed boyfriend and I don't want to be on a dating app and I hate all this situationship stuff. And, you know, being, you know, that is real vulnerability. And I think, you know, as well, talking to parents about it, you know, like, I think there can be a real connection between older generations if you start from where we started in this conversation. If you say, like, do you know how hard it is for me to not have experienced love in this way, or to feel like I have to compete in this? And then generations can kind of have more compassion for each other.
We're going to go over to our exclusive listeners section in a moment. And what I'd like to talk about is a little bit more about that, about how we could maybe encourage our lives to be less phone-based. Do you know what I mean? Any kind of tips you have around that, like living the kind of lack of the phone-based life? Because I need it and my family need it. But in the meantime, have you any recommendations that might be events or podcasts or films or books or stuff that you would like to recommend to our listeners, just in general? Because I think there's a wealth of stuff out there. In a way, we have too much stuff, and it's nice to get recommendations for that reason. You know, it's bewildering how much we have.
I think there's a lot of, like you say, there's a lot of solutions now, which now also feel overwhelming. So they're like, oh, you know, download this app to reduce your screen time, or install this thing, or like, get this meditation app that's the perfect one, and it's like, okay, now I feel like pressure in a different way. And so I actually think it's like incredibly simple, which is just like those things we were talking about, like going for a walk without your phone. Things that like cause you discomfort, like if you're thinking about it, if you're thinking, oh my God, like I had that whole journey without my phone and it's causing you discomfort, just doing that like tiny uncomfortable thing can really like change your relationship with your phone, I've found. So like even just getting yourself used to being bored and just like trying it and just seeing what it's like.
God,
like,
you're right.
I don't think people understand how like absolutely terrifying it is for young people if you said to them, okay, you're going to do 3 hours, a 3-hour flight, and you're not going to be able to like, you can't look at anything to do with your phone, you can't listen to music, you can't read, you're just going to sit with yourself. It would be like terror,
Torture.
absolute terror. But I do think the more you, like with anything, the more you do that tiny discomfort, it becomes a bit easier. And I also think as well, the advice I'd give to young people is don't do the like, there's all these like hacks that kind of slightly help. So they'll be like, uninstall Instagram, like don't delete it, but uninstall it from your phone. And then you can go on it on your laptop or something. It's like all of that is nonsense. It's
pretending.
Like, delete. The only way to stop the addiction is delete your account. And people will say, oh, you know, there's all these ways around it. Like, why don't you limit your screen time to this amount a day? And I really don't. I think it just becomes a slippery thing where you say, oh, okay, I'll just look at it this morning. Oh, I need to check it today. I need to like, and then it becomes you're still addicted. So
that's like the alcoholic. I'll have no spirits. I'll only be on beer. I'll only drink after 6. I'm only going to drink on Fridays. Before one thing we need to get into, which we forgot to get into, but we'll do it in the exclusive content because it's so interesting, around the kind of the SSRIs and our lack of kind of sexual drive. An awful lot of young people are on medication and it's impacting their sexual drive. And the ramifications of that, I think, is huge. And you've really nailed it in your writing before. So I'd love to discuss that. But I think we really should move into the extra content. What do you think?
Yeah, we're so grateful to have you here on the main show, and we'll keep this conversation going. But is there anywhere other than, of course, your Substack? You've done a lot of amazing writing. Anywhere else people should find you? Obviously,
real life
on Instagram.
Real life, Sasha. Walking down the road.
Basically, give us your address, and everyone will come bombard you at your home.
We'll hang out with you.
Yeah, no, there's nowhere else. There's Twitter. So I share my articles on Twitter, which is Freya India A. But that just will take you to my Substack. So Substack's the best place.
We'll be sure to link that. Thank you so much, Freya.
Thank you.
That was amazing, Freya. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.